Moving on, we now have Yvonne Agyei, who is a Google Vice President. Whoa. Though she is keen to let us know that there's lots of Vice Presidents at Google. But she is, I believe, Global Head of Benefits?
Yeah.
Global Head of Benefits for Google. So big welcome to Yvonne.
I'm going to start off with a question for you. We've been talking about happiness and well-being. What does well-being mean to you? And just shout it out.
Health.
Health, okay.
Work-life balance.
Work-life balance.
Freedom.
Wait, I heard two different things.
Energy.
Energy, okay.
Freedom.
Freedom, oh, that's a provocative one. Having a sense of humor, okay. Any others? Resilience, having a purpose. Wow, these are great. Well, when we started on our health and wellness programs at Google about, I would say 3.5, 4 years ago, we went to Googlers and asked them what well-being means to them. And we heard a lot of the same things that you guys are saying now. And what we decided to do was we actually categorized them into kind of the biggest buckets, if you will, right? What we heard was a lot around physical health. So someone said health. Physical fitness, being healthy, was one key component of well-being. Googlers also talked about emotional health. And this was a really interesting one because they didn't necessarily characterize it that way, but it was things like having freedom, spending time with friends and family, work-life balance, right? A lot of the stuff that you consider more sort of maybe a little bit more softer or fluffy, which we put into emotional health. And then I didn't hear anyone mention anything financial, but what was interesting is that Googlers told us that well-being incorporated financial health. In the sense of they wanted to get some advice or understand what to do with their finances. Googlers, we think, are pretty well paid, but they didn't necessarily understand their complete pay package or even what to do with it. And just to give you some context, we hire probably at least 25% of people every year straight out of university. Right? So these were people coming in and not really understanding how to manage their money, how to save for retirement. And so what we did was we started to establish programs in these 3 different areas. So this was about 2009 to 2010. And I have more questions. Why is well-being important to companies?
Sickness costs.
What's that?
Sickness costs.
Sickness cost? Okay, there was a question earlier today when Jennifer was speaking around absence, so I can talk a little bit about that. What else? Productivity, yeah. Staff retention, exactly, yeah. Okay, and then just 2 more questions. How do you measure well-being? How do you know when you have it? And
Retention.
Retention, okay. Morale, yeah, definitely, yeah. Ask people how they feel, exactly. Any others?
Leaving rates.
What's that?
Leaving rates.
Leaving rates, okay, yeah. And so that's exactly what we do, right? Is someone mentioned earlier in one of the talks today that Google, we spend a lot of time doing analysis, and we're all about data, data, data. And within people operations or HR where I work, one of the ways that we consider ourselves different is we start with the data. So over the past 4 or 5 years, we've been asking Googlers in lots of different forms about their well-being. And we ask questions around well-being, lots of different types of questions on our annual employee survey, which we call Google Geist, right? So taking the zeitgeist, if you will, of Googlers. Satisfaction, we look at morale, we look at how they think about work-life balance. We ask them about their managers and if they feel their managers are supportive of work-life balance, right? This year we had lots more questions around how do you deal with stress. And what we do over that time. So in addition to actually asking Googlers themselves what they think of their well-being, we also look at sort of independent data in the sense that in the US where we have the most information, we look at our health claims as well. So it's not just to look at what Googlers are telling us and how they're feeling, although that's one important component of it. We also correlate that data with attrition, which we're lucky enough to have very low attrition, but we look at disability, why people go out on leaves, right, which tends to be stress. And so through multiple sources of data, we are able to get a pretty good picture of what we think is going on at Google. And what are Googlers telling us, right? So over the last 4 years, we're seeing some really interesting trends and really interesting results that to our group and what we work on, and multiple groups actually across the company, are leading us to really think about our approach and what do we do about it. So first thing is Googlers are telling us that they don't necessarily have good work-life balance. Right? Is this a surprise to anybody? No, not necessarily, right? It's interesting, in Kathy's talk, she talked about detachment, and that is one of the key challenges for us at Google, is Googlers tell us that they have a hard time detaching, even when they want to. So the way the question is phrased, it's not just detaching while you're at work, but it's like when you're on holiday, right, or on weekends, when you're hanging out with your kids. And we watch this over time, and I have to say that this is one of the areas that is we're not seeing improvement over time. So this is a real challenge for us. Louis talked about email. We have a very strong email culture at Google. Again, back in the States where we looked at this data, our legal team looked at it actually because a lot of the work they do now involves email around discovery, right? And in measuring and looking at the volume of email at Google compared to average companies, what they came up with is Googlers send about 7 times the amount of email as other companies. So if you imagine the number of, when he mentioned he got 16 emails a week, I thought, I probably get 100 emails a day, right? And trying to keep up with that volume and being sort of enslaved to your laptops. That's the other thing as well, right? We make it really easy. Everyone has an Android phone. Everyone has a laptop. And so you can really be always on. And why is this important to Google? Well, someone mentioned retention, right? So the interesting thing about the data and the fact that we've been looking at so many different sources of it and studying it over the last few years is we're starting to see some really interesting trends, disturbing trends, I would say, right? We're starting to see that well-being is correlated with retention. So in other words, even though we have really low attrition, for people who tell us that they have low well-being, they are more likely to attrit, right? To just say, I can't continue to cope and work at this pace anymore. So that's one. We're seeing that it's correlated with innovation. So in our annual employee survey, we asked lots of questions around innovation in a lot of different ways. And what's been really interesting to discover is that Googlers who report that they have high well-being also report that they feel able to innovate and to be creative, which is really interesting. And then the converse is really stark as well, right? So the ones who say that they have low sort of self-reported well-being say that they don't feel like they have the time to innovate. And that's really important to us as a company, as Google, right? That we're all about innovation in everything that we do with our products, with our whole approach. So this is a key sort of business challenge for us, right? If we're not able to continue to innovate. And then satisfaction as well, right? So someone mentioned morale. We find that Googlers who have higher well-being, right, who report the higher well-being are actually happier at Google. So that's something we also care a lot about. So we're seeing those correlations. So what are we going to do about it? We actually have, there's one last question that I'll save for the end. But we have a cross-functional team. So we put together folks from my team from the benefits group, also working with workplace services who provide all of the resources that you saw in Jennifer's talk, our learning and development team, and I'm sure I'm missing other teams, and our people analytics team, the folks who do all of the data and all of the research for us. So we've come together, and this group has actually been thinking about this challenge and these issues over the past year and are continuing to work on it. And the framework that we're using is really, it's in 3 areas in terms of the factors that impact well-being. And the way we're thinking about it, it's at the individual level, the team level, and then the organizational level. So I'll just say a few quick words about those. At the individual level, we are really lucky at Google to be able to attract really strong talent, high achievers, people with past records of success. And they're sort of like type A people, right? And we know that coming in. We hire for that. We do a very good job of hiring people who are really highly internally motivated, and they want to do good work. So that's at the individual level. The team level, so you take all these people that we hire, we throw them in together. We like to think we don't have a competitive environment, which I think is the case compared to maybe some of the other companies that folks have come from within the technology industry. I won't mention some, but ones that are based in Seattle or Redmond. But one of the things I hear a lot actually from Googlers when they come in is they'll hear a description of their teammate, right? Or somebody or their manager, and they'll see that list, their resume, right, of what they've done. And they look and they're like, oh my gosh, how did I get in? So there's a little bit of, it's sort of like when you go to an elite university and you look around at the people around you, there's a little bit of that intimidation factor. And I think part of what happens is, although we don't have a competitive environment, your peers, which by the way is the #1 rated item in our annual employee survey, right, in terms of what Googlers like best about working at Google, is working with really smart people who will challenge you, right? But I think there's also a flip side to that, which is trying to keep up and feeling like you have to do the same thing and reach the same level as your peers. So that's at team level. The team also encompasses the manager, right? So looking at what is the manager saying, is the manager supportive, the impact that managers, Julian talked about some aspects of good management, and we do follow some of that. We're trying to get well-being. We actually do what we call upward feedback survey, which is kind of a report on our managers and what their practices are, and if they are following those oxygen practices that we've identified. We'd like to get well-being inserted in that, right? Because what's interesting is that on our surveys, Googlers tell us that, yes, my manager, and it's almost close to 90% will say, my manager is supportive of my goals to balance work and life. What's interesting is when you ask people, does your manager actually have good work-life balance? And what's more important, no surprise, right, to those of us who are parents, it's not what you say, it's what you do. Right, so the managers who don't take their vacation, the managers who are sending emails at midnight or 10 o'clock, who are doing work and asking for things on email on weekends, those are the signals, right? So the manager may be saying one thing, but if they're not actually modeling it, that has a huge impact on the team. And then the last is at the organizational level, and that's a little bit harder, a lot harder to crack. This is looking at, what as a company are we doing, whether intentionally or unintentionally, that perhaps if you take the individual and the teams, is perhaps maybe exacerbating the situation. So things like, as a company, first of all, Google is involved in lots of different businesses, right? Which makes it that we're competing in a lot of different areas. And so a lot of teams have really big goals, and they're competing against lots of different companies for talent and obviously for getting products out. So there's that sort of external stress, if you will, right, that's set up. Internally, we're very much a performance culture. We used to do reviews every quarter. We've now, I'm happy to say, moved to twice a year. So that takes some of the pressure off. But looking at, and we used to have this crazy sort of 50-point system, and really trying to figure out it's someone, and you're rating a 3.3 or a 3.4, and what's the difference between that? And people would actually obsess about that, right? So it's really looking internally and looking at our culture and saying, what are the things within our culture that we're doing that are perhaps negatively impacting people's well-being? So we don't have any answers yet. And so the last question I'll leave for you is, what steps could your company take to improve well-being and happiness of employees? Some of the things that we're trying is stuff that you've experienced here today, right? Anything from having great work environments. We're really, really fortunate to have as many resources as we do, but sometimes it's the simple things like the meditation. My manager actually starts his staff meetings with a 2-minute meditation. And it's interesting because I'm on video. The whole team is back in California. I'm on video and I participate along with them. Last night, we extended that to include some practice. Anyone here familiar with Qigong? Okay, so we started incorporating some of that, and it was really interesting and doing the stretches along with my colleagues in the conference room. But it actually makes a difference, right? So things like that. We have yoga, we have fitness. We're going to do some experiments around sleep and exercise, and also looking at team norms, which is really interesting around sort of flexibility and what are the expectations that we may implicitly be setting within our teams that make it hard for people to have good well-being, right, and to practice flexibility most of all. So the approach that we're taking is doing lots of different experiments, trying a lot of different things. We know that there's no silver bullet. There's not one thing that's going to work for everyone. What we're trying to do is, it's a little bit like the oxygen study, is to find that set of maybe 10 things, and maybe you don't do all 10 things, and for your personal situation, maybe you need to focus on 2 or 3 of these things that we can share back to Googlers so that they can figure out, depending on where you are, right, what will work for you and in your situation. So I'm going to close. We have about 5 minutes left. I'm going to close with sort of a personal anecdote about sort of the interplay of the individual, the team, and the organization. So I joined Google 10 years ago, and back in California, and I got to start this team that was actually responsible for university programs, which meant I traveled a lot and went out to universities. So I was sort of constantly on the road. And I have to say, I loved it. Right? I was in university for a long time. Google is very much like an academic environment. And so I basically threw myself into it. I'd never worked so hard in my life. And I mostly did it for me, right? And just really threw myself into work and worked all the time. Never detached. I was the person who was on holiday and was constantly checking email. I would sleep with my phone next to me. I wasn't a very interesting person. No, really. All I did was work. Last weekend actually was Mother's Day in the States. I was back in the States last week. My kids are here, but we celebrate American Mother's Day. And it was really interesting because my daughter turned 13, and about 4 years ago when she was 9, for Mother's Day in her class, they had to make an award for their mothers, right? Your mother is best at baking cookies or doing whatever. And the award that she gave me, I still have it, was my mother is the Google Employee of the Year. And she went on to list why. And it was things like she works all the time. And it was the interesting thing about this is from a 9-year-old, it was complete lack of irony, right? She was just really reflecting what she saw. So she works all the time. She doesn't come to family events. She's super dedicated. I mean, it was all of the stuff that I read and I literally wanted to cry. And I thought, this is what, for the past, I started working at Google when she was 2. So this is what, for the past 7 years, I've been doing. And basically, we went through that exercise of what's important to you and how much time are you spending on it. And clearly, my priorities were all wrong, right? So I took this into my manager and I said, I need a sabbatical, right? We didn't have a formal sabbatical program, but I said, I need to take the summer off. He let me have it. I detached from work completely. And what was really interesting about that is it actually gave my team the autonomy to make decisions, right? Earlier in one of the sessions, we talked about pre-approval. Well, they couldn't get a hold of me. So they just had to make the decisions and get on with it and tell me later. And I traveled, I spent time with my family, and just completely sort of changed. It really had a huge impact on my life. And what was most interesting was coming back to work, I brought that same attitude with me. I've never gone back to the way that I was working before. And there were a couple of things from an individual standpoint, obviously my own behaviors, and I tell my team this all the time, what I realize is I'm not that important. And that's okay, right? And it's okay. It's, every once in a while, maybe we're making life or death decisions, but really, I can trust my team to make decisions. And I don't need to be working at 3 o'clock in the morning, and I don't work weekends, and I don't work on holidays, right? So just having that, and the interesting thing about it, and having moved to London nearly 2 years ago now, where there's a huge time difference, right, in the time zone. And what's been really fascinating is I realized that I actually work fewer hours than when I was in California, but I'm much more productive. So I'll just leave you with that. Any questions?
Good for you.
Thank you. Yes.
Thanks. It was really, really interesting. I've got loads of questions actually,
Sure.
but I want to come back to the question that I asked earlier. What's your
right.
sickness absence rate like?
Right.
Because and you also mentioned at the beginning that one of the reasons or one of the main causes of sort of absence was stress, and you're probably exactly like every other company. It's the biggest cause of sickness absence.
Yeah.
Yet you're creating an environment that is supposed to be wonderful.
Right.
Building resilience, and I'm just keen on what the hard numbers are there.
Yeah. Now, the interesting thing is that, and those of you on my team, correct me if I'm wrong, is we don't actually track absence, right? Obviously people have to report it in the system if they send it in. In the US, for example, we have unlimited sick days, and so you don't have to track it, right? If you're sick, stay home, and you don't need to put that in. So that's not something a metric that we really track. I will say that we don't have a big issue of people being out when they're sick. If anything, it's the converse, right? People still come into work. People are really engaged and they love the work that they're doing. And so we sometimes have to send reminders. If you're sick or you have flu symptoms, please stay home, right? Don't come and infect all of your coworkers. So that's not a huge concern for us. When I mentioned stress and going out on disability, it's more, it's less sort of the periodic sick days that people have. It's more when people are burning out. Right, so it's more that we're seeing, and how do we prevent that? And so seeing maybe more incidences of that. And we've got lots of different resources to help with that. Many of our locations now, we have on-site counselors, psychologists, and that people can go to, and Googlers do use it. And if anything, we're trying to figure out how to keep up with the demand, right? Yes?
Do you think you're doing too much for Googlers? Because if you do, I mean, it's amazing, it's wonderful, but I kind of, I kind of feel like that's the flip side of the work-life balance. It's so nice, but when the hell are they ever going to go home?
Yeah.
And you've got, I mean, why would you?
Yeah.
Do you also, where you take young people who haven't really lived outside of university life, how do they integrate into the community? And you've got some issues around the shuttle bus and
that's right.
all that sort of thing. Do you
right.
kind of think about how to get that balance right as well?
Yeah. No, that's a huge issue for us. On the question of do we do too much for Googlers, I think in some ways, yes. One of the concerns we have is just the sense of entitlement that does tend to creep in when you do everything for people. They expect even more. That's one. The other that we also think about is, are we infantilizing our employees, right? Can they not do, Jennifer mentioned people not being able to cook because they don't have to. They can have breakfast, lunch, and dinner at Google, right? And so trying to help them kind of help themselves. And in some locations, so for example, in our Dublin office where we hire loads of new hires from all over Europe and then bring them into Dublin, and they form very tight-knit communities, and they do everything together, which is great on some levels, right? But the problem is what happens is if one person leaves, then it starts to break down that social fabric and they start to leave. So we actually do things around spend time outside of Google, get to know Dublin, make friends who are not at Google, right? Both as a retention issue and also to address this same challenge.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's worth looking at what the Stoics did for that sense of entitlement.
Yeah.
Once in a while, you don't eat for a day or two because you then appreciate what you've got.
Yeah.
Rather than a vicious circle of sort of connoisseur and bon vivant, which is what happens.
That's right. That's right.
problem.
Yeah. We've actually been thinking about, should we send Googlers out into normal companies, right? Just spend a week in another company and just get a sense of everything that we have and this whole idea of gratitude. And that's something we're actually considering. So good question.
I noticed in the bathroom that you've got signs up that say, remember to say thank you. Is that because gratitude is a problem?
I think it's a different kind of thing. It's actually a new system that we're trialing. We have our compensation team. We have peer bonuses that people can give to each other. So if you really help me, go out of your way to help me with a project, I can give you a peer bonus. And what we're trying to do is get people to do it within this new system and perhaps not to think about the money and actually saying, thank you, and you can actually make it. It's a pretty cool system actually, where you can then copy somebody's manager on it. And so providing more of that recognition and visibility in small ways and not always connected to money. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Fabulous again. Thank you.